Welcome to the Not Old Better Show. I'm your host, Paul Vogelsang. This is part 2 of our interview with ultra runner Mark Cliggett, and you're listening to Mark run in the background. Part 1, of course, is available at the Not Old Better website. But during part 1, you'll hear Mark and I discuss his definition of ultra running, Mark's training regimen and preparation, his course planning, and what Mark calls stuff often happens during race day and how to persevere. You can go back and listen to part 1, but today, in part 2, Mark and I discuss, among other things, Mark's memorable races, great race locations, inspiring stories from Mark's racing, and you do not want to miss this, and Mark's excellent list of resources for runners, volunteers, and anyone interested in learning more about ultra running. Enjoy the show, and remember, you can check out photos, videos, and other details on Mark's ultra running website, pointlanana.wordpress.com, which I'll link to via the show notes. Mark Cliggett, welcome back to the show. Let's start today's show after having talked so much about race day and how you prepare, what racing means to you, a little bit of the differences between some of these races. But tell us today about some of your memorable races, and the highlights and the lowlights would be great to hear, as well as some of the things that you even look for in a really great race prospectively.
So in terms of race experiences, it's been pretty amazing that both the highs, the highlights, and some of the sort of harder moments in these races, that some of them are so long. I mean, a 50K is not that much different than a marathon. I can finish a 50K in, say, 5 to 6 hours. Someone who's fast can do it in 3.5 hours. That's fun, and those are just fun races. But a race like any of the 100-mile races, I think I've done 5 of those, something like that. There's just a lot that goes on, and often they start out really well because I'm fit and I'm ready to run, and it's early in the morning and it's not hot yet, and we feel good, and we're just chatting, and we all start slow because it's so far. So it's just this sort of nice experience of running and being outside. And then it gets hard at some point, and it always gets hard. And some of the more memorable things are the hard moments. There's lots of different kind of, sometimes it's just fatigue. You go up and down hills for a long time, and it turns out your quads are getting cranky, and you have to be a little bit creative about how you navigate things. I've seen people walking down hills backwards because their quads don't work anymore.
Wow.
I don't think I've ever had to do that, but I've definitely had quads that were very angry at me as I was running down a hill. One of the first times I was running. A lot of people will have stomach issues. I've had that a few times. Often that's related to heat. Heat is by itself can be a big challenge. I did a race in San Diego this year where the race director said the heat index hit 108, and people really, really wilted during that race. I ran a pretty famous race called Western States a year ago, which was my first experience with heat, and I melted there. I thought I was doing okay, and then as I came out of an aid station, I suddenly threw up and went down into a really hot canyon, and then had to climb back out. And
Western States is in the Sierra. It's in California. It's in kind of northern California. It ends up close to kind of the Central Valley. Is the
right.
range?
It starts at Squaw Valley, right near Lake Tahoe, and then runs through the mountains and eventually the hills down to Auburn, which is just east of Sacramento. And it's the oldest 100-mile race, and it's known for being hot. And in particular, there's probably 4 big canyons that you drop down into where the air just doesn't move, and the sun bakes the hillside. And so if it's 90 degrees in Auburn, it can be 105 or 110 in the bottom of the canyon. And I thought I was prepared for the heat, and I had done some stuff to mitigate it, but this one climb up to a place called Devil's Thumb, which is aptly named, just did me in, and I had a hard couple hours after that. Ended up lying down in a creek, letting the cold water wash the heat away.
So
for
do you
like
think you,
10 minutes,
I
which
mean,
is pretty.
as a kid, I remember my parents kind of dunking me into a cold tub to reduce a fever. Were you even heat stroked that you felt almost feverish?
I don't know. I didn't get that bad, I don't think. But I was really dragging. My stomach was wretched. I really had to work to get food in, and you can't. If you don't get food in, you're going to fall apart eventually. So you're trying to get stuff in and keep it in, even if your stomach is unhappy. And so there's this great creek at the bottom of El Dorado Canyon, and they actually had a couple volunteers helping people get in and out of the creek safely. So I went down there and lay there, and a friend took this picture of me just lying there, which is one of my favorite pictures of me, quote, running in an ultra race. It's an interesting race, and somewhere in there I talk about this experience of falling apart as I dropped into Deadwood Canyon and climbing out to Devil's Thumb. So heats can be a challenge. Things like blisters or chafing. Each race I learned something. My first race, I got bad blisters under both feet and kind of hobbled for the last 40 miles to the finish. And so after that, I was really determined to sort that out.
Are you actually
Next race,
wearing out a pair of socks as you're running that kind of distance? I mean, do you have to?
not really. No, socks generally hold up that far. The shoes, if they start in good shape, they usually end in decent shape. I mean, it is a long way to go. You're
Yeah.
definitely putting some wear and tear on everything. But
Mhm.
like for me, if I coat my feet with some kind of lube, there's
Mm.
something called Trail Toes,
Mhm.
Body Glide works, Vaseline, and I wear a decent pair of socks and pair of shoes that works. My feet are generally fine, even if I'm having to wade through streams multiple times. Other challenges, a common one is going off the trail. The trails are usually well marked with little ribbons and sometimes signs, but as you get tired, it's easy to miss a marker.
But at night,
Uh,
you can probably easily lose your way out there in a dark, of
Yeah,
course, it's not like the track is lit for you. There's nothing out there other than just your headlamp, right?
right. And yeah, so I actually got lost, not lost, but I went off course sort of in a way 3 times during that race. Once was at night, once was in the afternoon right after coming up a really hot climb where I came around a corner and saw this beautiful meadow in front of me and a runner ahead of me, and I followed that runner into the meadow and totally missed it. I should have turned my head to the right and seen a marker taking me off in another direction. So I followed the runner for about a mile and finally caught him, and then noticed he didn't have a bib on him anywhere, and
Uh,
remembered I hadn't seen a marker for a while, and I went, uh-oh. So I turned around and found my way.
this is a maybe a point during this kind of competition that almost lends itself a little bit more of a mature athlete, a little bit more of a mature perspective, and irrespective maybe of age, you might lose your way and really have that affect your whole mental state. But you were able to kind of problem solve, as you've talked about a little bit. It probably comes as a bit as a result of your being the age that you are. Again, not old, more mature runner.
Maybe. It would be nice to think that. I mean, people people know that these bonus miles are part of the experience sometimes, and there's some pretty funny stories about people making spectacularly bad route finding errors during races. One guy in a race that I did this summer at Lake Tahoe turned a 15-mile leg between aid stations into like a 33-mile epic run,
Oh my gosh.
where he made 3 wrong turns, and ultimately the race sent someone out to get him because he was basically the last person out there, and they wanted to
Oh
make sure he
goodness.
got back safely. And on that third wrong turn, instead of turning towards the aid station where the rescue runner was coming from, he turned away and ran backwards down the trail at a high speed because he was feeling good. He'd felt rotten
Uh-huh.
for a while, and now he's feeling good. So he's like running really fast in the wrong direction away from the person who's trying to save him. And anyway, that's it. You know, weird stuff happens. So
Yeah.
but and yeah, you kind of have to accept it.
Uh-huh.
And yet you also have to pace yourself, in a very literal way, because you never know what's going to happen. You might get to a hill that you didn't notice when you're planning for the race, or you might go off course and have to, travel an extra 5 miles, or it might be hotter than you think and your water might run out a little bit early. So
And this is
it's
just pacing yourself is just a clock in your head, or is it? Do you actually record a distance with a device?
yeah, yeah. You'd asked about like, do I what do I pay attention to, blood sugar or whatever
Uh-huh.
else. The um, A lot of us are wearing some kind of running watch, some sort of GPS watch that gives us a pace and time, and you can do, basically splits between aid stations. In reality, for the long races, a watch is super helpful, so you know how long you're out there, and you know roughly how long it's been since you left an aid station. The pace stuff is actually probably depressing if you pay any attention to it, because a lot of times we're going up pretty long, maybe steep hills, and so instead of, say, a nice 8 or 9 mile pace that we might be running on the roads, we're walking uphill at 20 minutes per mile, or I've seen 30 minutes
Hmm.
per mile. At some point, I'm walking so slowly that it won't even give me a pace anymore because it thinks I've stopped. Um, so a lot of us wear the watches. The watches only last a certain amount of time.
Just because of battery life.
The battery life, and we're out there past that. I've
Mm-hmm.
in the Tahoe race this summer that took me 77 hours and something to finish. I ended up switching back and forth between two watches, just partly so I'd have a record of the course, showing me where the hills were and stuff. Partly because it is helpful to know. I have a plan beforehand. I think it might take me 6 hours to get from one aid station to another. It's helpful to know that I've spent 5 hours, and even though it feels like I'm never going to get there, probably I'm not more than an hour or two away from the aid station. So, and then I do wear a heart rate monitor
Hmm.
typically, at least for a while in a race, mostly so I start out slowly enough. Late in a race, it's not at all hard to go slowly enough. The hard thing ends up keeping up, being going any kind of reasonable speed and running when you can instead of just walking the whole way. But in the beginning, it is pretty easy to run faster than you should for the distance. So I'll wear a heart rate monitor just to say, wow, my heart rate's up a little bit more than I think it should be. So I'll just slow down here or even walk for a while and recover. So I have the energy later in the race.
You mentioned 77 hours you were into the Tahoe race. I think that was the number. Some of these races will go 150 miles, and you could be out there for 77 hours, but there's a cap on the total amount of time that you can be out on the course, right? And so, for example, like a race like Western States, you had a upper limit that beyond which you're not considered a finisher. Is that the way to put it?
Right. And yeah, the races, almost all of them have a cutoff of some sort. So Western States has a 30-hour time limit to go 100 miles. You get a special belt buckle if you finish in 24 hours, which maybe a quarter of the runners do. Most of us take more than 24 hours, and if you don't finish, if you don't cross the finish line before 30 hours, you're not an official finisher. Even if you cross the finish line a minute later, when people go to Western States, uh, everyone wants to be at the track at the finish line for what they call the golden hour, the 29th to 30th hour. And every year there's some excitement at the very end because someone's either um, they come in across the finish line just before the time cutoff, or they end up being on the track when time expires. They're
Let's
not an
shift.
official finisher.
Okay, so let's shift gears, and rather than talk about races per se, let's talk about racers.
Sure. At Western States, a year and a half ago when I ran it, I finished, I think, just under 27 hours. So it was a decent race. I had hoped to go under 24 hours, but the heat got to me, and I ended up kind of slowing down and really focusing on enjoying the experience. One of the big stories at that race was this woman, Gunhild Swanson, who's from Washington here, who we see at races occasionally. I think this is probably where I became aware of her. Um, Janet, my wife, and I were running a 50-mile race, and it was Janet's first 50-mile race, and she was doing great, but she had fallen near the end and was having trouble keeping up a run. She was just sort of worn out. And as we were coming down the last hill, probably 3 miles from the finish, this elderly woman, she's 70 years old, Gunhild Swanson, ran by us. And Janet said, "That's Gunhild Swanson." I was like, "Oh, okay, I've heard of her." And then Janet decided she didn't want to be beaten by a 70-year-old woman, so she started running again. And we not sprinted, but we worked our way downhill and gradually caught Gunhild. And I had fun because I was just running with Janet, but I was watching these two women who were in their 50s to 70, basically, passing a lot of like 25-year-old men who had started too quickly and were now doing the death march towards the finish line. So they would race past these guys. It was great. Anyway, so we saw Gunhild there. And then at Western States, Gunhild was trying to become the first 70-year-old woman or 70-plus-year-old woman to finish the race. And as I was finishing my race, my pacer, who has this amazing ability to look at his phone and run at the same time, started getting updates on various racers, including Gunhild. And I think probably the first time we heard where she was, because a lot of these races you can get at least somewhat real-time updates on where they are as they come through aid stations. That time will get uploaded, and so I think we first saw her probably when she was about 5 hours from the finish, and she was a distance out. Well, she had 5 hours left to finish, and she had just come through an aid station that was about 5 hours away from the finish line for someone traveling at her pace. So it seemed like she was, it was possible. Sometimes people will speed up at the end if they've managed their race really well. Sometimes they'll slow down. So it was kind of interesting and looked like she might be successful, but we weren't sure. And then some time passed, and we got another update. And I think by then we were probably at the track. We'd finished, and we were just standing around. And again, she seemed kind of right on the edge. Then
in terms of her time and kind of
in terms of her time and how much time she had left.
Okay, so you were doing some math. You and maybe some others were actually kind of just doing some triangulation. I mean, kind of figuring out where she was, how she could get to the finish line, given the amount of time left to meet the cap of the 30 hours.
Right. There. I mean, it's kind of simple. I mean, there's simple math. You have 15 miles left to go, and there's 4 hours left to do that. Well, that's almost a little bit slower than 4 miles an hour. That's 15-minute miles. It's kind of hilly. It's not hilly. It's flat. Her pace. There's a bunch of ways to look at it where you can kind of get a sense, but you never really know. And people have problems out there. It turns out, like about with maybe 15 miles left, her grandson was pacing her, and she took they took together. They missed a turn, and they ended up running uphill for about a mile on the wrong trail. They knew they had to go uphill, but they went up the wrong trail. when you go off course, you have to turn around and go back to where you got, partly just to find the trail, but also they don't want people taking shortcuts and stuff
Sure.
like that. So the rules just say you have to go back to where you got off trail, off course. So she went back down, continued on. We didn't know this. I think in the next update we got, it looked like she was a little bit behind schedule, and it was going to be tough for her. There's a kind of an aid station, more of a checkpoint, about 1.3 miles from the finish. The finish is at a track at the high school in Auburn, at Placer High, and you come onto the track off the street, and then you have to run about 300 yards around the track to the finish line, right by the stands.
So there's a kind of it's a high school track, so it's clearly not trail, and it's very obvious that it's part of a kind of a stadium environment, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's, again, it's the golden hour. There's probably, I'm guessing 500 people there. Some of them are runners. Some of them are crew for the runners. Some are spectators. Some are the race organizers. And they're people who've been out there running for 29.5 hours, 29 hours and 45 minutes, and they're finishing, and we're cheering them in, and they're really happy to be done. And we get an announcement that Gunhild has reached Roby Point, which is the checkpoint about 1.3 miles. That's at the top of this kind of the last hill, really. You come up a dirt road. It's this incredibly red dirt that just stains everything. But come up, you get to Roby Point. Now you're on city streets.
Okay.
Quiet city streets, but you're on the pavement, and you still have to go uphill a little bit, and then it kind of rolls and then drops down into the aid station. So we get an update that Gunhild is there. And I think we heard that about 15 minutes before the cutoff. And my friend Bob looked it up and found out that the women's winner of the race had taken 15 minutes to get from Roby Point to the finish line. And it seemed somewhat unlikely that the 70-year-old woman who had just run 100 miles would be able to perform as well on that section as a really, really talented Olympic class runner had just a few hours previously. So it seemed unlikely at that point. And then we figured she would need to hit the track with 2 minutes left to get around the track in time. And even then, I mean, that's sort of 9 or 10 minute mile pace, which is pretty fast again after
at that point.
Miles.
Yeah.
And at 2 minutes, right as we'd hoped, the announcer says a runner's approaching the track, and everyone gets excited, and there's a whole lot of cheering, and the runner gets on the track, and we're all cheering really, really loudly, urging this person on. And then we realize it's not Gunhild. But so the cheers died down a little bit, but it's still a runner who was trying
still
to
rooting for it. Yeah.
So they came around, and then like with a minute and a half left, 90 seconds, Gunhild shows up on the track, and the other runners come around and probably finish, but Gunhild's there, and she's on the track. The stadium, all 500 of us or whatever, are going wild, and we're doing math in our head again, and 300 yards in a minute and a half is something like 8 minute mile pace, which is pretty fast. It's not insanely fast, but again, she'd come a long way, and seemed possible, but a stretch. And so she ran down the back straightaway, and that's about 100 yards, and she used up, I think, because I was tracking this, she used up like 37 or 40 seconds of the 90 that she had. So she had to go faster than that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she was losing time as she was running, and it seemed really, really unlikely, but we're all on the railing right on the other side at the finish line, watching and hoping and
screaming. And
yeah, exactly. And she comes around the backside. We can't see her, but we're just watching time tick away on the finish line clock. And she comes around to that last straightaway, and we're just Sorry, I get choked up.
Oh, I know. And please take your time. I
Any
I know the
go,
story, and I lose this. It's so powerful. But and so please do take your time.
so she's come around the straightaway. We're standing right on the railing, and she's to the right, and the finish line and the finish line clock are to the left. And we're just looking back and forth at the clock and at her, trying to figure out, is she going to make it? And she comes by. I managed to take a picture just as she comes by of her and her, I think it's her son, who's pacing her at this point, and he's just screaming at her. I mean, it was, super supportive screaming, like,
Sure,
do
pride.
this, do
Yeah.
it, do it, do
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And her eyes are just really, really focused on the finish line at that point. And I think right after I took that picture, I looked up at the clock and realized she would make it. I think she had 12 seconds left. She had like 30 yards to go. She ended up finishing with 6 seconds to spare. The whole place went wild. There was a
Six
huge amount
seconds.
of hugging and tears, and
Yeah.
it's probably the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So,
Yeah, and at that age, it's an accomplishment. It's rewarding, but it's inspirational, I think, for everyone who's around to see that. And then I think the other interesting part of this, and we kind of talked about this in our first episode together, and that is this community, because you all are as much in her corner as you can possibly be, and probably as equally so with her son or her grandson or whoever that was. But it is a community of very supportive, thrilled, uh, fans even.
yeah, I think, yeah, I think the people there were so excited that she finished, and as you say, it is very inspirational. A lot of stuff went wrong there. I mean, going off course when you're on the edge of being successful, it'd be very easy to give up there.
Yeah,
It'd
and
be
at that
very easy,
point too in the race to go off
right?
course. Yeah,
It'd be very easy to get pissed off at your grandson, because the pacers are there partly to help you avoid making wrong turns, but you know that's not cool to get pissed off at
right,
your pacer, because if you go off course, you're responsible for it. And yeah, the pacer
right.
might help you avoid it, but you're supposed to be paying attention too. And if
Yeah.
you have to own what goes wrong. So she was incredibly gracious about that. And afterwards she said, yeah, we went off course, but there was never any hint of blame. And uh, so yeah, it was pretty amazing. We actually saw her again. Janet and I volunteered at the Devil's Thumb aid station this past year, because it's where I melted last year, and I wanted to see if people looked as bad as I felt last year, and some did.
Somewhere
Uh,
in
but
the
but but Gunhild ran it again this year. She's trying to improve her time, and
gosh.
again, I think probably become again the oldest woman to ever finish at 71 instead of 70. And she came through, and she ended up dropping, I think, at mile 80, because like when she came through our aid station, she was about 8 minutes ahead of the cutoff or something. So she really had no time to sit down and deal with anything. And a friend who was on our crew told me afterwards that she had finally dropped because for about 8 or 10 hours she had been chasing cutoffs with no time to. They're intermediate cutoffs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
not just one at the end, but they'll have cutoffs along the way, so that
Mm-hmm.
people who are just not going to have no chance of making it aren't out on the trail.
And maybe
And
trying to push themselves so hard that they even injure themselves too. I
yeah,
mean,
it's partly that, but it's also
mm-hmm.
partly for the volunteers.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, right.
When someone goes on, then the aid stations have to be there. You have to go out and find the runner because they're going so slowly, and they can get into trouble. So it's a safety thing, but it's also at some point you just have to say, look, you're not going to make it, uh, and people need to be able to go home. But she had spent like 10 hours with blisters on her feet, and she'd never had time uh, deal with them because she was right on the edge of the time limits the whole way. So
some serious endurance. It's something to hear you talk about it. I think it's and it's very inspirational to hear you talk about it. I think it would be. I think many of my listeners would be interested in maybe showing up at a finish line. Maybe they'd be interested in being a part of a support team or volunteering, and maybe that could then lead to enough of an exposure or experience that maybe at some point they want to begin training and racing. But say somebody came to you and said, "Hey, I think I want to volunteer." What would be some of the things you'd tell them to kind of do first and foremost to make that happen?
if you don't know anything about the world, that world of ultra running, it probably seems kind of intimidating. It did to me. But it's actually a pretty small. It's one of those worlds where once you make a couple connections, it's pretty easy to figure things out. And it's a super inclusive, welcoming world. You just have to kind of make those first few connections, and decent places to do that. Local running stores. There's ultra races all around the country, everywhere. There's trail races, many places, and usually someone at a local running store. Especially if they sell any kinds of trail shoes, someone there's going to know something and can point you in the right direction. A couple online resources. There's Trail Runner magazine that has a lot of good content, and we'll have like a race directory as well. There's a magazine called Ultra Running. I think that some of the content is behind a paywall, but that's another good one. There's a site called Ultra Signup, and that's how I sign up for a lot of my races. And you can search for races there based on geography and dates.
Okay.
So if you're interested in doing something in the next couple months in your area, you can do that kind of search. So those are some ways to just kind of make a few beginning connections, and maybe a nice way of seeing that, at least a glimpse of it, is volunteering at a race, maybe at an aid station, handing out water or helping people with their drop bags, or putting a Band-Aid over a skinned knee or something like that. And especially at an aid station later in the race, you can kind of see the scope of what people are going through. Some people are doing great. They've gone through a hard patch, but now they're feeling great and they're moving along. Someone else is in their hard patch and they just need a little bit of encouragement and maybe some help changing a shirt or something like that. I like the volunteering, but there's a lot of people out there helping them. There's the volunteers at aid stations. Sometimes a runner will have a crew driving around the course with special food or gear or whatever. But it is nice when people are out there.
Of course. And what an insight that we've been able to get on this sport from you, and we're going to be rooting for you. Maybe you'll come back after San Diego or after the plane race. We would love to have you back.
Sure. Be happy to.
That'd be great. Well, Mark Cliggett, thank you so much. Congrats on all of your success. I can't thank you enough. Thanks, Mark.
Sure, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
My thanks again to ultra runner Mark Cliggett. He is inspirational, has some amazing stories to share, and what a great resource. Remember, you can find Mark's site, pointlanana.wordpress.com, via the show notes, and check out the photos and the videos. Mark was kind enough to share the image of him that he refers to during the interview, where he's partially submerged in the river as he recuperates from his Western States race. Heat exhaustion. It's a great picture, and I certainly understand why it's a favorite of his. It's remarkable. And as usual, we'll post links to everything. And also, as usual, my thanks to you, the listeners, for joining me today. Your time is valuable, and I'm grateful that you're spending some of it with me. As I've said before, I'm always interested in feedback. You can leave that at iTunes, Google Play, or send me email at info@notold-better.com. That's info@notold-better.com. You can find me on Voxer at Not Old Better, where you can easily leave a voice text, which, with your permission, I can play here on the show. Also, thank you very much for all of your support for the Not Old Better show, as we were selected once again as Podcast of the Month. Now that's September, October, November, and December 2016. We're off to a great start in 2017, so please vote us up again. That's podcastland.com, Podcast of the Month. We'll put a link up also in the notes. Stay tuned for our next show, another great one, and one you'll not want to miss when we talk to Forbes byliner and host of the podcast Next Market and the Smart Home Show live from CES. It will be Michael Wolf, who's on the show floor, where Mike tells us about the cool new tech for 2017 smart home, smart kitchen, smart health, wearables, and a ton of other innovative CES-only material exclusively for the Not Old Better show. You won't want to miss it. Remember, contact information for feedback and ideas, info@notold-better.com. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, SoundCloud, everywhere else. Thanks, everybody.